Hello, hello. Hi, Rachel. How are you?
I'm doing great this morning. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I am in Atlanta. Where are you joining us from?
I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Okay, not too far. Not too far. So, for those who are joining us, welcome. Thank you so much. We appreciate your presence and we just want this to be an open conversation. So, if you have a comment or a question that you would like answered, please feel free to put it in the chat. We'll try to get to as many as possible. But tell me a little bit about you, Rachel, and how you got on this journey to not only healing yourself, but helping other people heal as well.
Yeah, totally. So I come from a pretty chaotic, traumatic background, but I knew some of it in the midst of it, but I didn't realize to what extent until my life came crashing. I was young married, raised very, very conservatively, and I didn't necessarily agree with all the things that I was raised with, and I knew that. But when my marriage fell apart and I was left as a single mom, and I had mortgage and bills, and I had been a trad wife, and I was sitting there overwhelmed with trying to figure out how I was going to handle everything and pay my ex-husband out for the house, all of those things. I sat there one day and I was completely depressed.
Mm-hmm.
And, I had lived through having a vacant mom. She had a mental breakdown when I was really little, so I knew what it was like, and I promised myself as that 6-year-old self that I would never, if I ever had kids, I would never allow my kids to live through that.
Mm-hmm.
I sat one evening and I realized I was like a hair away from being that vacant mom.
Mm-hmm.
I was barely surviving underwater, and I was so crushed by the reality that I was so close to being that, giving my kids the thing that I swore I would never give.
Mm-hmm.
And it was that moment, like that quintessential, like bottom of the well, that I was just like, nope, I refuse. I put my foot down. I refuse. I will not allow myself to go further down this. My kids deserve better. And at the time I couldn't make that choice for myself. But that moment was when I was like, no, something's got to change. And so then I started the process of, I'm a healing or recovering perfectionist and value chaser based on deeds. And so I went full perfectionist on that mode, and I started reading book after book. I started going to therapy. I joined a community of people who were trying to change their life, and learned fairly quickly that my viewpoint on healing was, when I started, you'll appreciate this. I sat down with my therapist and I was like, okay, so here's the deal. I don't have a lot of time. I don't have space. So I think we're gonna work through this in about 8 weeks.
Okay.
Round of trauma. Week 1, we're gonna do this. Week 2, we're gonna do this. I'm just going to turn into the storm. We're gonna power through. I'm gonna get on the other side, and we'll all be done. It'll be great to have known you, and we're gonna move on. Like, that was my.
You had a game plan.
I did, and I thought that, man, if you just like grind, you could get through it. And I learned fairly quickly that often when you try to grind through healing, it's not healing. It's just another form of trauma on yourself.
But
I started that journey about 4 years ago, and somewhere in the 2-year mark is when I started having, at this point, I read, like, I don't know, over 30 books on how the brain functions, CPTSD, autism, ADHD, trauma, coping mechanisms, functionality of the brain. Anyway, after going through all of that, my heart song about what I wanted to do and what I wanted to be changed. And I wanted people who were like me before to have a person that was communicating really about therapy and about
Mhm.
healing. Because when I went through it, it was a lot of like, it felt like a lot of people saying like coin phrases, like you might find on a needle stitch, where you're just like, oh, you just keep trying, or like,
Mhm.
look on the bright side. But people weren't talking about like the fact that you can go from like, you get to a place where you mentally comprehend something, right? But the stage where you mentally comprehend it and where you can innately just like
Oh, yeah.
have it be part of you is a huge disconnect, like the bridge to
It
go
is.
from mentally understand to I can live this out. And I never saw anybody talk about it. And
Mhm.
it made me feel very isolated and very alone during the journey. And so I started talking about just things I had learned, and I fell in love with the idea that there are other people who are just like me
Mhm.
who needed to hear that information. And yeah, hundreds of thousands of people out there do. But I knew, and I came across certain people that said something that I had heard before, but I couldn't hear it till that moment. And the idea of being able to be that for somebody else was magic.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's back up a little bit. People are joining us and they hear us talking about healing. And I think that depending on where they are in their grief, they receive that word different. Like when you're at the stage of like acceptance, like this has happened, I realize that I can't change it, I'm not in resistance, then you can approach that word healing a lot more. I feel like open hearted. But if you're in the beginning, and you don't want the marriage to fall apart, you're still trying to hold on to a situation that might not be serving you, you might not be ready to hear that word healing.
Yeah.
So let's jump back because we're going to talk about how you work through going from chaos to the calm, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And so take me back a little bit to when you started to feel like things were falling apart. Like, what did you notice? Were there red flags that you missed? Give us a little bit of background
Yeah.
into your relationship.
Yeah, totally. So when my marriage started to fall apart, I was a person who was he was the first person I ever dated, the first person I ever did anything with. And I never ever thought of divorce or that not working out as a possibility. So when I started seeing that it was, started trying to compute that it could not be, it was something my entire person rejected.
Mhm.
Um, he ended up moving out, and then we went through what's called diagnostic therapy, which basically means that you and your partner sit in a room with a therapist and you talk through things to see if it's something that you feel like is possible of healing or not. Because for me, I couldn't comprehend the idea of not being with my ex-husband, but I also couldn't comprehend the idea of moving back in with him.
Mhm.
And so there's this like complete conflict, complete like every part of me was fighting each other because it was two dichotomous truths that I couldn't comprehend, and I couldn't
Mhm.
accept both of them as being true.
Mhm.
And there was a moment that happened because we'd have these therapy sessions together, and then we'd have therapy sessions one on one. And I had a session where I was sitting there, and it was the last one where we were going to have alone before we had the final meeting. And the therapist turned to me and said, okay, so I need you to visualize a future where you live on your own. So I sat there and I thought about it, and there was sadness to it, but there was like a place I could wrap my head around. It was painful, it was sad. It wasn't what I wanted, but there wasn't terror with it. There wasn't
Mhm.
like, and then she asked me to visualize if my ex-husband moved back in, and I quit breathing.
Mm.
I started having a panic attack. My entire
Just from
body,
the thought of, just from the thought of.
yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And so
Mhm.
I started shaking. I started battling myself because I saw my body responding, But I knew that that meant that we wouldn't have a future. And I couldn't, like, I started weeping,
Mm-hmm.
sobbing, because I didn't want that. Even to this day, all of the things that happen, that man has my heart.
Mm-hmm.
And, but he doesn't have proximity to me. And accepting that truth is not something that happens one time. It's not something that happens in a short time period. It's something that for me has had to happen and happen and happen and relapse and happen and happen. So if somebody's in the midst of, they love this person, but they also are seeing themselves being anxious and tight and um, walking on eggshells is how I would describe it, where you
Mm-hmm.
constantly are like, everything you're doing is mitigating and pillowing, and you're trying to keep yourself and the other person like calm, and you don't even realize it until you have space. I
Yeah.
didn't even realize until, like, as I didn't ask him to leave, he moved out. And it wasn't until I had space that I realized what level of anxiety I was living in. I didn't sleep. Like, I would have 2 hours here and 1 hour there, but I couldn't sleep.
Mm-hmm.
The
Mm-hmm.
first day I was by myself, I slept for 8.5 hours straight.
Whoa. Like what you're talking about is something that I see all of the time. You know, like trauma can distort our sense of self
Oh yeah.
and our sense of safety. And then even like you are holding on to something that was not actually safe for you, but it was your norm.
It
It
was my
was your
norm, and it was better than I had ever known before that.
Mhm,
And that's
mhm.
like, it's hard to know that there's something like I if I tried to talk to me back then would not believe me, because I didn't feel like there was better. I didn't feel like there could be more. My ex-husband was so much nicer and so much better and so much more loving than I'd ever experienced previous to that,
Okay.
that the idea that there could be different, or that I deserved something different, was not something I could have wrapped my head around.
Mhm, mhm.
But yeah, it's definitely, when you get used to it, when you are in it, you can't even see past it. Like when people would talk about it, I'd be like, oh, well, we all have our idiosyncrasies. We all have our like, and that's very true. We all
It's true.
do. But sometimes somebody's idiosyncrasy can be something that's perfectly fine for one person and perfectly traumatizing for another.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it doesn't mean it's a degradation to my ex-husband that that's how I responded to it.
Mhm, mhm.
But it doesn't matter whether I wanted that to work. How I was responding to it, how I received it, how I was handling it, and the fact that there wasn't a way around it was traumatic for me.
Yeah. You talked about your life prior to him and your mom. You called her a vacant mom?
Yes.
Okay, describe that in your terms. I
Yeah.
know what I think
Yeah.
when I hear, but like for the viewers, what do you mean by that when you said that?
Yeah. So my mom didn't want to be that. Um, like I said, I come from a very traumatic background. It came out that my mom it makes my childhood look like my childhood looks like peas and carrots and beautiful things compared to my mother's. My mother had a
Mhm,
terrible childhood, and her thing she promised herself, like I did for myself, came true, happened to me.
mhm,
And when that came out, she couldn't handle it, which I understand so fully, having been on the precipice of doing that same thing that I promised.
mhm,
But when it
mhm.
happened, my mom broke.
Okay.
When I say vacant, it's have you ever talked to somebody and you can see their eyes are empty? The life is
Mhm,
dead.
mhm,
Have you ever seen somebody that you're talking to and you know they're not hearing you at all?
mhm.
Have you ever seen somebody make a meal, or like when you're driving on the highway and you miss 50 miles?
Yeah, they're just going through the motions. Like
Yeah.
they're
My
there,
mom,
but their spirit, their soul
yeah,
is yeah.
yeah. So there was a moment when I knew my mom was struggling and I knew why, and I had compassion for her as a 6-year-old we'll go into, like, I shouldn't have necessarily known any of that, but I did. And so I understood the hardship she was in, and I felt bad for her. But there was this moment, I was 6 years old, I had fallen and scraped, and I was bleeding. And I came
Mhm.
to our apartment, I opened the door, and my mom is sitting on the couch, just staring ahead, and she's crocheting.
Mhm.
And that was my mom's coping, like the thing she did to like try to help herself, is she crocheted.
Mhm.
And I called for my mom, and she just kept staring forward. She was so in her own world, she couldn't even hear me. I walked closer, and she's sitting there completely oblivious.
Mhm.
For me, in that moment, I was like, I'm alone. I'm alone.
I get it. I get it. And so going from that foundation to marriage, and then now you're looking at your children, it's like I often reflect on the layers that people have to peel back, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's layers to it. We have to unlearn false narratives. We have to, kind of find ourselves all over again. What were some of the hardest beliefs that you had to challenge in your own healing? What were some narratives that you had to kind of rewrite as you
Oh,
started peeling back the layers?
so many. So many. I think the some of the hardest things to learn for me is, I love the way you said peel back the layers, because um, growing up conservative, there's this communication that you have to put off yourself, right? Um, and my process in healing, what I have learned is it is nothing about putting off of yourself. It's not changing who you are. It's learning the difference between who you are and the things that you picked up along the way to cope.
Mm-hmm.
So I am not a person who has to be perfect. That's not a part of who I am. Perfectionism was the coping mechanism I had, because I knew that if I failed, what would happen?
That's so powerful.
And
Yeah.
so learning that, the idea that who I am, the core of who I am, and having to learn that, as I was a huge fawn. Like, I did all of the different aspects of butterfly, but me, I changed everything about me. I hollowed myself out like a shell for whoever it was with. It was
Mm-hmm.
constantly a different person, because that's how I survived.
Mm-hmm.
But as a person who did that, trying to figure out who that core is felt like the biggest, most ominous task,
Mm-hmm.
because there was nothing left. I was a
Mm-hmm.
skin suit that
Mm-hmm.
pulled on other people's things. And so everything that felt like me was an amalgamation of everything that I'd pulled in and what was left over. So there's that truth. But I think even further back than that truth is, I didn't feel like I was worth it. I didn't feel like I was worth it. What's it? I didn't think I was worth love. I didn't think I was worth effort. I didn't think I was worth time. I didn't think I was worth anything. I could see value and love other people, and I would give so endlessly. And it's something that there was a saying that says, you can only love another person as much as you can love yourself. And I
Mm-hmm.
hated that saying, because for me, I was like, oh, fork that.
Mm-hmm.
I know how to love other people so hard. Like, I give and give and give. But the more I have gone on this journey of trying to get to know myself, trying to love myself, trying to accept myself, as much as it made me uncomfortable, it's really true.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason it's true is, you can't give compassion fully and encompassing to another person if you can't give it to yourself.
Yeah.
You can give it in some layers. You can give it in some, but here's a great tangible example. If you have kids or little
I
tiny
do.
people around you, right? There's these moments that happen when you're raising kids or around tiny people, where you go from being completely calm to being completely angry and livid in just like a moment. And sometimes they're really easy to identify. Like, one that was really easy for me to identify, even well before I started healing process, was messes. Every time a mess happened, I went from being completely calm Hindu cow to being so like just rage. Like, have you ever seen what is it? Inside Out,
Oh
the red
yeah, I love it.
guy, or Clue with the flames licking my face. Like, that was like that, oh, that fury. And for me, I knew it was because what happened to me when messes happened, but I thought I had become the monster,
Okay.
right? Like, you have those moments where you can see it. Like, I knew exactly, I could see the childhood memories that I had, and I thought what happened was I became the monster. And so I had bitterness and anger at myself because I became the monster I hated.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth is, you're not the monster. You're afraid. And your body is fighting that fear with anger.
Yeah.
And so when moments happen, when those moments happen, it's your childhood self saying, no, I can't handle this. So when you can sit there and own to yourself and say to yourself, it's just a mess.
Yeah.
And you can say that out loud. Like, I started saying that to myself and to my kid out loud. It's
Yeah.
just
To
a
try to
mess.
ground yourself, remind yourself. Yeah.
Just a mess.
Mm-hmm.
But the realization that I wasn't the monster, but instead I was afraid. And then started saying that to myself, giving myself that compassion, giving myself that understanding, and giving it to my kid at the same time. That's a tangible example of what it's like to need to be able to give yourself compassion, to be able to fully give it to my other kid. Because even though I wanted to give my kid compassion in that moment, I didn't have the capability of it. I didn't have the space for it because I hadn't made the space for myself. And that's what I mean by you can't fully love another person, give another person grace, give another person compassion until you have the ability to pull it onto yourself. Because in that moment, I didn't give it to myself, so I couldn't. I revolted from the moment and gave anger to a tiny child who would then possibly do it again the next time.
Yeah.
In the next
It is
generation.
so hard. It is so hard to find your calm in the
Oh,
midst of chaos. And chaos can be internal or external.
oh, for sure.
It's the hardest thing to do. So tell me, like, for the people who are maybe still in the chaos,
Yeah.
right? They're like, I hear you. I want to ground myself. I don't want to displace anger on the wrong people. Like, what advice would you give to someone who's struggling to find a sense of peace and they're in the middle of like just pure chaos?
Yeah. So the first thing I'm going to say is going to be really hard. Grace. The biggest, best thing you can do for yourself is give yourself grace. And the
Mhm.
biggest and best thing you can give to somebody else is giving yourself grace.
Yeah.
Because the more you give yourself grace, the more you can give understanding and compassion to another person. If you are in the midst of chaos and you don't have places that you feel safe, another thing that's linked to that grace is find, even for 30 seconds, safety for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's going into the car and it's waiting 30 seconds before you go into the grocery store by yourself. Or maybe it's in the shower and you lock the bathroom door and kids bang on the door and you take the 5 minutes to be by yourself. Give yourself the moments of safety you can.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say safety, this isn't watching a TV show. This isn't reading an amazing book. Those are all
You're not
fantastic.
talking about escaping. Yeah, there's a
No.
difference between escaping and a
And
sense of safety.
yeah. And when I say this, that isn't to denigrate escaping. There's a time and a place where that is coping and that is necessary. But when I say safety in this moment to that person who's in chaos, those 30 seconds, sit,
Mm-hmm.
as uncomfortable it might be, with yourself. And it might start, as for me, it started with 15 and 20 seconds is all I could give myself.
Mm-hmm.
And it was choosing in that moment to literally just breathe and focus on breathing. That's where I started, because for me, I couldn't handle what happened in my head. I couldn't handle trying to talk to myself. So I just sat and I would breathe.
Yeah.
And then once I got more comfortable with that, I started doing small things that helped me feel more present, because there's a saying that says, when you're overthinking, you are self-abdicating, right? And what I mean by that is when you spend the time to sit there and think in your brain, you're either thinking about what has happened in the past or you're thinking about what will happen.
Mm-hmm.
You're not being present with yourself. And so in that moment, when you are sitting there and overthinking and worrying about what will happen, or you're worrying about what did happen, or you're processing what you just got hurt, or you're processing what might happen if you do this thing, You are leaving yourself abandoned in this moment.
Yeah.
And the more you abandon yourself in this moment, it's really hard to get out of overthinking. But when you abandon yourself, you are traumatizing yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I found that was tangible for me to less abandon myself when I didn't know how to do it other ways was you can look them up. They're called grounding exercises. But one of the ones that was really easy for me to remember was 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Everybody can count down.
Yeah. I like that tool as well. Mm-hmm.
And so what that is you use your senses. Say 5 things you can see and you name them out loud. I can see this computer in front of me. I can see the window seal. I can see my kids drawing. I can see my bed, and I can see my carpet below my feet. Then you say 4 things you can touch, and you touch them while you say them. Then you do
Mm-hmm.
3 things you can hear, and then you take 2 deep breaths, and then you can say 1 thing you can smell. Like you just use whatever senses you can, and you can change it up. You don't have to remember which ones are which. It's just about getting yourself back to where you are to be with yourself.
So
And
true. It's
so
it's
for me,
it's so true.
yeah, those were the things. If you're in the middle of chaos, any moments you can give yourself to breathe and be present with yourself, it will scientifically, when you do that, that deep breath, you are helping your body go from being this to being this. And while it doesn't change all of the chaos out there, when you can change the chaos in here, that doesn't matter as much.
Mm-hmm.
But the grace has to come alongside every step, because if you're sitting there like I did in the beginning, and you're going to hit your head against the wall over and over and over again, because I could sit there and ground myself I wanted, but the moment I got frustrated, the moment I went back to being dysregulated, I would self-shame. And shame is not a place of growth.
Mm-hmm.
Shame is not a place of love. Shame is not a place of good.
Yeah. Yeah.
So grace, everything. It's grace is the soil anything can live in. Shame is the sand that will dry everything out.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. And you were carrying such a heavy burden. You were striving and praying and hoping that you would not repeat a generational cycle.
Yeah.
And so that in itself is heavy, right? Because anytime you saw yourself uh, mirror your mom in any way, or there were characteristics that you didn't want to show that you should, automatically it was, oh no, oh no, I'm repeating a cycle, which was your biggest fear,
Mhm.
which it motivated you, but at the same time it was a shackle,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
I would
So
say ultimately, often I would think of those big moments that, like me yelling at my kids or me being starting almost to be a vacant mother. What I would now, what I would say was actually the biggest thing that I was repeating was self shaming, self degrading behavior.
mhm,
Because the reason I got to that place was because of the devaluation that I had and the failure I felt, because my life didn't look how I thought it was supposed to look, because I
mhm,
had failed. And
mhm,
that failure was a part of me. All of the actions that I could point to and saw in the beginning, all of them come back to me not giving grace and compassion to myself. And
mhm.
that is the seed. And if you treat the seed, if you help the seed, a lot of the topical stuff changes.
You're so right. You're so right. You're so right. And I mean, if you're watching, I hope you realize that there were some practical tools. Like Rachel has given us some practical tools to help with our emotional regulation. And we realize that, like, there are some situations where you cannot just snap your fingers and change, right? There are some situations where, it takes some time to get out of, or some time to get to healing. And while you're in it, there are positive coping techniques and strategies that you can lean on, or negative ones. And so Rachel, I'm so happy. I feel so blessed. I feel so fulfilled on this Friday that you were able to give some very practical tools. Tell people where they can find you. Like, what are you working on now? Where can they find you? If they want to work with you, what can they expect? Just
Yeah, totally. So you can find me on basically every social media. I have my handle is Healing Rachel Abbey. I also have a podcast called In the Nude, Raw and Honest Healing. So I just talk about what it's like to like you saw here. It's not cookie cutter. It's not cutesy. This is hard. This is what I struggle with. These are things I've learned, and I'm very transparent about it. So those are the easiest places to find me. You can also find I have um, another Instagram where it's Rachel Abbey 1, where I talk about parenting with
mhm.
healing. So if you want something specific with parenting, that is another place you can go. But Healing Rachel Abbey would be the easiest one.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation. There were moments where, everyone I've had on the podcast thus far has made a connection between childhood trauma and current day trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact that you have something for parents so that we can know better and do better is so powerful. So thank you so much for that. And I hope everyone watching has a wonderful weekend. If you are a helper in any way, you're invited on this platform. If you have experienced trauma and you have a testimony to share, you're invited on this platform. It is a safe place. I believe that there is healing and testimony in sharing our stories. And so, if you are interested in being on the platform, please reach out to me. If you are looking for a therapist and you want to work with a therapist, please reach out to me. If Rachel has said something that has spoken to your spirit, your soul, and you want to reach out to her, please. It doesn't matter who, it's not one size fits all. It doesn't matter who you choose as long as you're being heard, as long as your experience is being validated and you have somebody who understands you, please, please, please reach out to her. So thank you so much, Rachel. And you all have a wonderful weekend.